Republican strategist Ford O'Connell via Skype. Ford, welcome back to America's Forum.
Well, thank you for having me on, JD. I just want you to know that economically speaking, raising the minimum wage is probably the dumbest idea since New Coke was invented. It costs jobs and it hurts consumers' buying power. But this is campaign season, and guess what? Logic and emotion are about to collide because the Democrats want to run their favorite play. The GOP hates the poor.
Well, the interesting thing about this, and they wouldn't be able to do it if it did not resonate in the polls. And I can remember my first 2 years in Washington, where Congress, at the start of that first Republican Congress in a half century, we had approval ratings of over 70%. And yet, the one issue where the public still flocked to the left was on the notion of raising the minimum wage. Now, as we take a look at that, Ford, what is it? The fact that so many people just feel, well, it's not my money, I can be generous, this is something business owners should do. What happens to on so many polls, give the left the upper hand with the public perception of the minimum wage?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, according to Reason, I like to use the Reason Root poll on this one. 67% of Americans support an increase in the minimum wage. Now, here's the kicker, JD. 58% don't want to do it if it costs jobs. Herein lies the problem for the Republicans. 59% of Americans don't understand that if you raise the minimum wage, it's going to cost jobs. And Republicans need to get out there and explain that to people and say, hey, don't take our word for it. Listen to the CBO, the government's bean counter, who keeps score on this because they're telling you it's going to cost jobs and hurt your buying power in the long run.
Now, the Department of Labor has a map of the United States that shows the minimum wage by state. And of course, there are states like Washington State and California. I think about the Bay Area, where the minimum wage is higher than the federal minimum wage. You see a handful of states in the southeastern United States with no minimum wage law. Just taking a look at the federal minimum wage, does this always and forever remain a campaign issue, or is there a significant economic livelihood or well-being at stake if federally you see an increase to over $10 an hour, the kind of increase that Tom Harkin was championing with his bill in the Senate?
Well, let's remember, though, the 21 states in the District of Columbia that have higher than the federal minimum wage standards are also states that not only are Arctic Blue strongholds, but generally speaking, minus your former Arizona, are ones with very, very high unemployment. This is nothing more than a campaign tactic to turn out women who basically 60% of those who are making the minimum wage are women, and basically another half are under the age of 25. This is about turning out women and minorities and the youth vote at a time that they're abandoning the Democratic Party. Now, let me put on my Mitch McConnell hat, if you will, JD. Here's what I would do. I would say raising the minimum wage to $10.10 is too much too fast given Obama's tepid economy. He's had 6 years to fix this. Put us back into power. And what we will promise you is that we will investigate the federal minimum wage such that it does not kill jobs, but also helps to stimulate consumer buying power. That is a promise, because America, I know you're hurting. This is what Republicans need to do. They need to make sure that people, particularly in the marquee states, know that the minimum wage costs jobs. And most people don't know this stuff, JD.
Well, it's very interesting, Ford, as you take a look at what's going on within the administration and the cabinet level agencies. For example, the Department of Labor is featuring stories of minimum wage workers. Let's take a look at a couple of those. And here you see the Twitter feed, quote, "Last Christmas, I couldn't afford to send my grandchildren anything. Ruben, a cook making $8 an hour in D.C., hashtag raise the wage." And then you have another picture here on the website of the Department of Labor, quote, "Like Rocky, we're going to keep fighting for what is right and what we deserve." Now, this is very curious that a government agency, in essence, is running a political campaign. We'll leave that alone for a second here, to the point of trying to say this hurts real people. How do you counter that? What do you tell? I've got an idea, but I want you to share with those watching. How do you make a case against that kind of tweet about, I couldn't buy my grandkids presents last year at Christmas?
You send out a tweet that says, guess what? State X raised the minimum wage above the federal minimum, and I lost my job. I'm going to lose my job. That is really what this is all about. Remember, this is campaigning, JD. This isn't logic. This is emotion. And a lot of Democratic voters, particularly on the base, are very visual. They like to see things like that. So you have to counter it the exact same way you counter it with Obamacare. Guess what? I lost my insurance, and now I can't pay my medical bills. It's the exact same idea, JD.
Well, I take a look at this and I just think about how many jobs are lost because of the federal edict. And if you really wanted to get esoteric about it, you could say, why ever have a limit on a minimum wage? Take it up to $100. And you know there is never an ideal. You never seem to get an answer for the left saying, oh, you bet, we do that in a heartbeat. Now listen, another controversial topic, Ford, we need to talk about immigration. Speaker Boehner now says there isn't any secret plan to push an immigration bill through the House. But a top Democrat tells us there's not only a deal in the works, it's an open secret. What are you hearing from your vantage point about what's going on Capitol Hill?
Well, right now, the Republican leadership has a good thing going in the polls, and they don't want to mess it up, if you will. They're very likely to sit on their hands. At the same time, though, that does not mean that there aren't some House Republicans who want to see immigration reform take place. Mario Diaz-Balart in Florida, Kathy McMorris Rodgers in Washington State. There are some that want to do it, but I think right now, if you actually want to do something, JD, and I know you and I disagree on this issue, even though we both technically come from border states, and that is, at the end of the day, I would do something after July, okay, after the Republican primaries are over. I'm not talking about comprehensive immigration reform. I would put forth what it is Republicans want on border security so that we can build off that, because I don't think anything's going to happen, JD.
Well, you know, it's interesting you mentioned that, Ford, because yesterday I had Jennifer Rubin on this program, the Washington Post columnist, a delightful lady, often considered the voice in print of the Republican establishment, and she actually said that my Enforcement First Act of 2006 that President Bush wanted nothing to do with, she said a lot of elements of that Enforcement First bill, if the GOP was going to do anything in the House, it should be Enforcement First or a variation of what I sponsored a decade ago.
Now imagine that, JD, great minds think alike. I agree with you, and that's exactly what we need to be doing, is putting out and ratifying in the House a legislation that talks about enforcement first. Something else I would do, though, because this is a twofold problem before we get to what we're going to do with 11 to 12 million undocumented workers, is remember, 40% of those who are undocumented in the United States right now overstayed their visas. So I'd also put forth a bill like you're talking about, and also put forth a second bill on exactly how the visa system should work. And then I would stop and sit on my hands so that everybody knows exactly where we are. And if the Republicans do take the Senate in 2014, I would do something on immigration reform. And here's why, JD, and this is where we're going to disagree. And that is, I believe that if you ignore the problem over time, you're going to exacerbate the problem. And the reason is, by 2043, the United States, whites are going to be a minority. And by 2060, at the current rate, if we do nothing, 1 in 3 U.S. residents will be Hispanic. We have to do something about this, because obviously it's easier to get here illegally than legally.
And as I look at the video, I see Bob Fernandez of New Jersey, one of the most partisan members of the left, there with some Republicans in the background calling for this comprehensive reform. You and I disagree on a couple of points. Number one, when you fail to enforce the law, that's where the problem has come. And number two, obscuring the debate, calling this an immigration debate when it's really a debate about illegal entry into the United States.
But JD, I absolutely agree with you. It's about the rule of law, first and foremost.
And we're going to have to come back.
There's a human element to this, JD.
I will tell you this, my friend, and I've got a human element. We're going to have some time to talk about this more in depth. Unfortunately, our time's up today. Ford, we thank you for your perspective and a good, healthy disagreement at the conclusion. Hey, when we come back, I'm interested in new grooming regulations for the Army. You'll hear about them next.